קו החסד והושיענו. Welcome, everyone. So good to be joined again on this occasion, and so grateful to you all for making the time and space to gather like this as a community. We are on Zoom, as usual. Not our favorite way to gather, but it's a good way to gather, just as long as we follow the few things that help this to move and flow smoothly. So one thing you can do is just bring your presence here. If you turn on your camera, if you feel comfortable, we really feel you. We feel your presence. If you can put on a gallery view once in a while and look around at the other faces and maybe even give a smile, a wave at a friend. Feel free to use the chat function. It's a really important way that we can all communicate and still be focused on learning, and keep your mute on so that we can hear the voices of our great teachers here today. And I'm going to pass it on to my dear friend and colleague, Beth Huppin. Please, Beth, take it away.
Thank you, Chava, and thank you for your beautiful music. And you bring us into the room with such open our hearts as we enter with your beautiful music. So thank you. I want to also welcome back Rabbi Samuel and acknowledge your loss, that you weren't with us last time. And although, as we were talking beforehand, I definitely felt your presence, and your teachings were flowing through me in many ways. And so I thank you for that. And I want to again dedicate our study today in memory of your father, Shalom Yisrael ben Shmuel, Yehi Zichro Baruch, may his memory be for a blessing, Victor Klein. And I also want to invite others, if you are, at this time of year, especially before Yom Kippur, we are carrying with us memories. Some people or others are also in mourning at this time, or with Yizkor approaching, thinking about others. If you'd like to put names in the chat box of people whose memory you would like to raise up during our study today, feel free to do that. I know there's many memories in the room today. And may our study bring comfort to you and to everyone, and merit to the soul of your father, Rabbi Samuel, and to the souls of all those who we're remembering today. We're gathered today because this is an ongoing series. We started around Pesach, and Rabbi Samuel reached out to me and said, we need to do something together as a community. And I want to thank the Federation, and Nancy Greer, I see, is on the call too. Thank you to the Federation, and to reaching out to Jewish Family Service and including us together and making a statement for the whole community that we want to support each other. And I want to give a shout out to you, Nancy, and to Rabbi Will Berkovitz, and really to all the leaders in the community in Seattle and across the country who are carrying all of us through this time. It's hard to not be able to gather together at times when gathering together is exactly what Jews do. That's how we comfort each other, right? So this moment, these teachings, really thank you all for making this possible. And I want to give a special thank you to Susan and Lonnie Edelheit for helping to sponsor this today. And I'm going to also thank Tony and Alana. They are behind the scenes doing the tech stuff. And if you have any problems at all with technology, just chat them privately, Tony or Alana, and they will help you. The chat, as was mentioned, is available. Please use it. We probably will not be able to respond to things in the chat. We will look at them afterwards, but that doesn't mean you can't write in there and communicate with each other and add to the conversation in the chat box, so please feel free to do that. This is a very emotionally evocative and I won't say difficult, but heavy, full time of year for Jews, and add to it everything else going on in the world. And so that's what we want to talk about today. Yom Kippur and Kol Nidre in particular brings about memories and people we want to talk to. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Samuel to start us off on like how we might acknowledge that and talk, because as we see in text number 2, by the way, that the texts are available to you. We're not going to read them all. Feel free to just follow along or just listen either way, or download it later if you want. But when text number 2, it's written here: death does not end a life. People are left afterwards still trying to figure out what to do about it. They need a way to feel connected, and that's why we come together on Yom Kippur, to feel connected, to remember together. And Rabbi Samuel, I'm going to pass it to you now.
It's very meaningful, Beth, to see everyone joining and sharing the names of those who they're thinking of at this time. And personal note, it's very meaningful that this learning and the other week's learning was dedicated in memory of my father, Victor Klein. Thank you so much for your kindnesses in doing so. But may all the neshamot mentioned and those who need refuah have an aliyah, have a refuah, complete refuah, from our learning today and the learning we have been doing in our community these past weeks. It all begins in a car ride through the Vermont woods. Vermont is very well known, and New Hampshire as well, and Massachusetts, for New England in the fall. And it was my first time traveling through these gorgeous woods in 2016. Took a car ride from Stowe all the way up to Montreal. And as you do on a car ride, you have a number of podcasts or Spotify playlists that you know you're going to be playing on the journey. And it just so happened that on this journey, Gila and I, my wife and I, were listening to This American Life. And some of you in this space might recognize This American Life as a repository of many, many wonderful things. This particular podcast was about a phone, a telephone, a special telephone. And we put on This American Life expecting all manner of things about what the phone might be. And the title was The Phone of the Wind. And we did not expect what was going to come next. In the 25 minutes about This American Life's podcast, we discovered a whole world, a whole vista about what Yom Kippur and this period of time might actually be, from a culture as far away from Judaism as you might reasonably find. The Phone of the Wind is a telephone booth. It's actually in a place called Otsuki in Japan. And those who know the space will know it from being hit by a tsunami. And tsunamis, as they are, wreak devastation on communities, and Otsuki being a coastal town was almost completely wiped out by the tsunami that hit Japan. And among those living on the hillsides outside of the town was Itaru Sasaki. And Itaru, in his backyard in 2010, had built a telephone booth, a white telephone booth, actually as a way of coping with the grief of having lost his cousin. It was a private moment for him. He didn't involve anyone else. He built a telephone booth in his back garden. And you will see on the first page, on page 2, inside of this telephone booth, he put a telephone, or the old style telephones, and he would call up his cousin, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, and have conversations with him. And then the tsunami came, and to cut a very long and very interesting story short, if you are very interested, there's a film out now in Japanese. Actually, it's a Japanese film about the Phone of the Wind, Kaze no Denwa. It's a phenomenal film with subtitles. I recommend it highly, about the thousands of individuals and families who found Itaru's phone booth in the months and years following the tsunami, and who made pilgrimage to this phone booth in his back garden. Over 10,000 people have visited so far. And what they would do is they would come to the phone booth. The phone is not connected to anything. And they would call up, and they would sit there, and some would just speak, talk into the phone. Some would have conversation. Some would speak with Itaru afterwards, who became a major celebrity in Japan in the years following. and who was quite perplexed by how this phone booth suddenly became a repository of all these conversations with the departed. And one such visitor, Tessa Fontaine, in 2018, came upon the phone booth. She made the pilgrimage from England, which is how I know, because Tessa is also an author. And I'd come across a book of hers in a very different context for another time. And in following her, discovered she had also made pilgrimage to this phone booth on the passing of her mother. And in source 1 on page 2, she says as following, second paragraph, just over a year ago, my mum died. For the 6 years before that, she'd been paralyzed on one side and lost the ability to communicate after a series of massive strokes, impaired both her cognitive and physical function drastically. Though I function mostly like a normal adult, I feel much of the time like I'm stuck in some whirlpool of loss. Here's a simple truth. I still can't imagine life without my mum. And that is a powerful statement of loss that many can resonates with many and is resonating very deeply at this time. How can I live without? How can I be without? And what the phone of the wind, as it was called, was doing was it was bringing back into conversation with each individual the memories of the person as alive and present. Clearly, not many people believe that they were talking to the departed. This was no seance. But for Mr. Sasaki, death is much longer than life. And this is really, as Beth has just shared, that the memories are containers of meaning. And Tessa's blog, which I really commend to you, and the link is here, is really about the facility that the phone offers. You pick up the phone and you're ready to speak. What if the shofar we've been hearing all these days in Elul and on Rosh Hashanah is really the phone of the wind? That what we're doing there is not closing our eyes and imagining that the sound has some sort of magical quality to it, but it's allowing us some way of accessing the memories of those who we cherish and care for. It is our phone of the wind, and the shofar is ready and available for us to pick it up, to listen, to plug in to conversations that we can have internally, that our language is carried on the neshima, on the breath. One of the beautiful sources that I've been studying recently is the Imre Emes, one of the Rebbes of Gur, a Hasidic master, the father of the Sefat Emet, some of you may know of him, and he makes a play on words, and we're now in source 3 and 4. He says that we read in the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah the following line, Ki ata shomea kol shofar u'ma'azin teruah ve'ein domelach. You, Hashem, you hear the call of the shofar, and you listen carefully to its sounding, ve'ein domelach, and there is none compared to you. And then we make the blessing, blessed are you who listens to the truah of your people, Israel. And he says there's something very special about this truah. What is it that's so special? We hear and read in another part of our machzor or our siddur, the phrase ve'ein domelach, connected to the resurrection of the dead, to chiyat hametim. Why is it that this blessing is made over the shofar and we say none is compared to you, God? We could make that blessing over any mitzvah. Why is it special that ve'ein domelach is connected to the blessing over to kiyat shofar, the calling of the shofar? Because the calling of the shofar is connected to raising the memories of the departed. That is what the Imre Emet says, that the blessing is specifically to recognize that the sounds of the shofar is accessing the deep well of collective memory of the departed in our personal lives and of our people Israel. And that is the blessing. We are reawakening those memories. That is the Techiyat HaMeitim. We are getting back in touch with those memories. Ve'ein domelach moshe'enu b'Techiyat HaMeitim. This is the melody that is about to call to us across the ages.
Kol nidrei ve'esarei ve'charamei ve'konamei ve'chinuyei ve'kinusei al nafshatana miyom kippurim zeh ad yom kippurim haba. Aleinu Litova.
The first time we utter this melody to this song, we do so quietly and softly. As in Source 6, Machzor Vitri, one of the oldest Machzors that we have in our canon, written in the 11th and the 12th century, says that we ascend in volume, first tremulously, approaching the palace of the monarch, offering a gift with reverence, and then somewhat louder with more confidence, until we enter the Sanctum Sanctorium, the inner sanctuary, where we are close with that presence as if with a friend. All the things we mention in this Kol Nidre on page 4, all of them serve as opportunities for presence, with sometimes the things that trip us up in the world, the utterances that get out in front of us and bring barriers rather than, unfortunately, bring connection. And just to bring a work of art from a contemporary artist, I think is very curious to me, is that if you imagine walking on a pavement and all of the cracks and the opportunities to trip and to fall are mostly hidden from view until they're not. And then you trip and fall. But we all recognize that there are cracks in the pavement. Cornelia Parker's work is all about the little things. And here on page 5, a piece of art which is all about the cracks. She's filled in the cracks in pavements in London and has raised them off the ground, suspended them by wire, so that we can see where they all are. All these things that sometimes get at our ankles and our shins when we're not noticing them, giving us nasty bruises, or maybe the utterances that offer other people opportunities to point out ways in which we are bruising ourselves. Either way, Kol Nidre is an opportunity to notice all the utterances of our mouths and of our actions that sometimes get out in front of us when we're trying to make a connection. Beth.
Thank you, Rabbi. Things get in our way, and nothing gets in our way more than ourselves. We are getting our own way, and when we start the Kol Nidre, before the actual Kol Nidre, if you turn back to page 4, we say we give permission to pray with the transgressors. Anu matirin lihipalel im ha'varyanim. So who are the transgressors? Because I think that will help us figure out how to not get so tripped up. And if we look at text number 9, it says here that this is Elbogen. He's a certain, the basic text on Jewish liturgy, the history of Jewish liturgy, and he says that all vows, meaning Kol Nidre, is preceded by the line in the court of heaven, b'yeshiva shel mala, and that's where we give permission to pray with the avaryonim, whoever these people are. And he says the ban of excommunication is lifted, that had been imposed on members of the community who had transgressed its regulations and who had been proclaimed avaryonim. And we permit them to participate now in worship. But that's actually too easy, I think, because it says somebody else is the avaryonim and we let them pray with us. In fact, I think today it's a better way to look at it is what Rabbi Avi Killip writes in number 8. Avaryonim is all of us. We have all found places where we have crossed over. Avar means to cross over, right? So we're annulling all vows. And we're annulling all, we're saying, we're all of Yonim. We've all made places where we say, I refuse to step foot here. I refuse to talk to this person. And we're saying, no, I'm going to let go of that and say no more. Because that's what's getting in my way. That's what's tripping me up, these ideas that I have decided who's in and who's out. What if I stop doing that? And that would invite me to come home to my true self, to repair relationships with others. And I'll just quickly take us to text number 10 before I send this back to you, Rabbi Samuel. And the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, he talks about what tshuva is. The returning is taking that sin and taking it and putting it on the side. Because what a sin is, he says, is an act that does not belong. And when we act in ways that we don't belong, that we shouldn't behave, then we take ourselves out of the community and we place ourselves outside of relationships and we feel lost. But on Kol Nidre, what we're saying is we can pray with everybody and I'm included. I belong. And he says at the end, but on this night, the music of Kol Nidre has spoken to them, meaning to us. And we say, here is where I belong. Among my people, among my faith, I am a Jew. I am not, none of us are of Yonim. None of us are transgressors, or perhaps all of us are transgressors. And when all of us are transgressors, then we can open our hearts, not just to each other, but to ourselves as well. And once we can open our hearts to ourselves, then maybe something can change. Rabbi Samuel, you want to pick it up from here and make a comment?
Yes, absolutely. Age 23, Baruch, soon to be Benedict Spinoza, makes a public declaration of his being one of the Avaryanim. He publishes articles, or actually pamphlets, relating to the extent to which Torah is divine writ and a whole range of other things. I should know, my wife Gila just finished a PhD on Spinoza, so we've been knee deep in Spinoza, or waist deep in Spinoza for some years, which has been a great journey. Spinoza and others like him are Avaryanim for having declared beliefs that do not align with the Kahal. It's not necessarily actions, but it's also ways of being that are othered. They are othered by those who claim to be at the center of the circle. There is nothing necessarily or absolutely wrong with those views or those beliefs, but for whatever reason, what gets communicated to those people they are Avaryanim by virtue of who they are. And that is painful. And that is tremendously painful to hear, that you do not belong in the kahal, you do not belong in the community. And sometimes that's tacitly communicated. And how many of us are there in our community who have done this by way of our words, maybe not by intent, but by just not being sensitive enough to the language that we use to include? That is just something that we need to pay attention to again and again, and doesn't speak to us being nasty, horrible people, but speaks to us being people who are more and more sensitive to the language that we use that invite in and include. And so one such person, Nathan Lopez Cardozo, who is mentioned here in Source 11, has struggled with this all his life. He, as some of you may know, is a teacher of Torah across the world in Limud. He comes from a strong lineage of Jews who lived in Amsterdam. And he struggled with his own identity as someone who is both in and out of the community. And we brought this source, Beth and I have been having a conversation. I know, Beth, we have different views on this particular source, but this idea of, we're all Marranos, or that we are in some way alienated. The word Marrano, as people will know, means pig. I mean, that's the word, right? That's the description. And that's a very, very hard word to bring into contemporary language in any meaningful way. And yet, sometimes, as Rabbi Cardozo mentions in the article from which this is pulled, we are struggling deeply with concepts that are borrowed from other cultures, that both speak to our Jewish life, but that also complicate it. And I take issue with what Rabbi Cardozo writes here, as Beth, I know you do, but to what extent are we struggling with binaries that no longer serve us? When Rabbi B'nai Lappi mentions the crash, Tony, a colleague of mine, and I have been having a conversation about this, when our narrative crashes about how our Jewishness can stand alongside other very clear identity markers, how do we pass that out? This melody is a deep melody in which we can marinate in those complexities. And no one does this better, for example, than Franz Rosenzweig. On page 8, Franz Rosenzweig, very, very famous Jewish philosopher, who writes the Star of Redemption from the trenches, from the front line, which I still can't quite believe. It beggars belief that he could write it on postcards. He has a conversion of sorts, where he seeks to make the leap to Christianity, where he believed that aligned mostly with his view of himself. And it's one evening in 1913, actually it was not Kol Nidre, it was Ne'ilah, the final service, where he has this epiphany. And it wasn't with the organ and with the 30-strong choir and with the pearly gates of the synagogue Aron ark opened before him with a resplendent Sifrei Torah. Apparently this was a humble, small, backwater synagogue. And he finds that he is connecting deeply with his own faith and with his people. And his philosophy flies out the window. He doesn't do philosophy after this. He begins to be involved in Jewish learning and founds the Lehrhaus, the House of Learning, which is the prototype for all adult education initiatives in the world, Jewish initiatives, afterwards, by the way. So this person, Franz Rosenzweig, has an epiphany, and that is that he belongs. He was on the outer edges, but the melodies brought him into the center. And attributed to Brian Eno, that sort of creator of ambient music, we found this lovely, lovely quote. And it goes like this, that everything has a deadline, but it's only an experiment until that is a deadline. And once you have a deadline, then there comes the productivity and the connection and community. In other words, everything can be an experiment until you have to get it done. And there's something about Yom Kippur and the Kol Nidre service that is the deadline for getting the work done. And maybe as we move into Yom Kippur, we can consider what are those items that we want to bring to Yom Kippur that are full of meaning, that we can sift through as a community and as individuals. There is no better deadline than Yom Kippur.
Icharat navehon, kulhon yehon sharan, shvikin shvitin, betelin umvutalin, la sharirin vela kayamin nidrana la nidre ve'esarana Ushevuatana la Shavuot.
What is it about the Kol Nidre that is so captivating? Is it the Aramaic that we're reading? Surely not. In fact, if we read the history of Kol Nidre, we'll know that it was hotly contested for centuries. In fact, many of the Jews of Babylonia, where the seats of the heads of learning were, outlawed it. There were rabbis who swore that Kol Nidre would never be said in their synagogues. These are rabbis, by the way, who are the architects of Jewish law. How was it that the Kol Nidre survived centuries of polemic? Certainly, of course, there were the great disputations in which brought forward was the Kol Nidre. Look, the Jews, they can't keep their vows. Every year, they annul their vows. And in fact, we have included in blue, for those looking at the sheet, there is a Sephardic rite and the Ashkenazic rite. And there was a whole debate about whether or not Kol Nidre, the language, should be orientated to the future or orientated to the past. Because lest our non-Jewish neighbors claim that we Jews are not trustworthy, that we will be given loans and that we will not repay those loans, that we make promises and won't keep them. And so one suggestion is that it isn't actually the words anymore, that the words are essentially anchors for a melody that has superseded those words. And the reason we all show up on time, or even amazingly before the time of the service on this occasion, many of us are very good at coming to the service just for Kiddush. But on this occasion, since there isn't any Kiddush anyway, we turn up on time. What for? Is it to hear these words, Kol Nidre? No. Possibly it's to participate in this melody, which has deeply infected and impacted our communities across the Jewish world, Ashkenazi specifically. There are other melodies. And this melody comes to us from we know nowhere not. I mean, it could have been created sometime in the 12th or 13th century, possibly later, but it's lost to time. We know that in 1765 was the first time that we have the melody that we play, that we sing now on record. And the Kol Nidre by Max Bruch, which was the rendition that we have, was played movingly and lyrically by the world-renowned cellist Catherine Dupre, who was married, of course, to Daniel Barenboim. And we're about to listen to just a minute of the opening stanzas of Jacqueline's rendition of Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre, of course, for her meant so much. She played it upon her deathbed. She had it played to her. A convert to Judaism who married into the faith. Kol Nidre for her was a container for everything Jewish, for everything that meant to her how she transitioned into this Jewish community. Let's listen to Catherine Dupre playing Kol Nidre. A song draped with a veil of grief, a night song dying away in the innermost recesses of penitent, contrite, repentant human hearts. Years ago I heard it on the Day of Atonement. The cantor began to chant that profoundly solemn and heart-rending song of absolution, so fraught with terror and yet so rich in mercy. I struggled with inexplicable emotion. I sobbed convulsively while hot tears poured from my eyes. Then I ran out into the night, my spirit torn and purified. This was Nicholas Lenau, writing in 1843, a diarist and essayist, not not well versed in Jewish text or Jewish law, but finding himself taken aback by this melody. Beth, we were talking about melody. How do you respond to this melody?
It's so evocative, and that's why we all want to be there, and we want to hear it together. And that's part of one reason that we're playing this music and having Chava sing it, so that we can be together to hear it, even if we can't all be together. At least virtually, we can be together to hear it. There's something about this music that carries melody, that carries memories that we can't even touch. They're subconscious memories. They're memories that are both personal and collective. There's that Jewish collective unconscious. And it doesn't matter when you became Jewish, right? It doesn't matter if you have childhood memories of it or not. There's a container there that is incredibly powerful. And most of us don't know what the words mean. It's definitely not about the words. We spend a lot of time, intellectually trying to understand the words. To me, that's just a waste of time. It's not about the words. I think Rabbi Alan Liu says it beautifully here. He talks about this melody reminding us that we're all avar yonim, in the sense that avar means to pass. We're all just passing through. We're all just passing through, and this sound reminds us, he says, that each one of us is just passing through. The pain we hear is in the first grieving notes of Kol Nidre is the pain of loss, the pain of impermanence. That's where we sit with our own impermanence when we hear Kol Nidre. But it's not just Kol Nidre, it's the music of the entire day. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Chava, to give us some more music, because I just ask us to feel whatever we feel. That's what prayer isn't about thinking. It's about letting something arise within us that we don't even know is there, and grappling with it and sitting with it and seeing where it leads us. So Chava, we're gonna let you do some more music, and then we'll talk about where might it lead us.
El male rachamim, shochen bamromim, hamitzeh menucha nechona, tachat kanfei hashechina, im kadoshim utahorim, kezohar harakia mazhirim. Lenishmot yakirenu shehalchu leolamim. Bal harachamim yastireim beseter knafav leolamim. V'yitzror bitzror hachayim et nishmatam. Adonai hu nachalatam. Ve'anuchu b'shalom al mishkavam. V'nomar Amen.
Standing in shul, my friend had very mixed feelings. The cantor was singing Kel Mani Rachamim, and he was about to say Kaddish for his father. And that relationship had been a very troubled one all the years. One might say it was even abusive at times. And my friend, who is a religious man, wanted to mark and commemorate his parents' passing through the saying of the Kaddish. And yet, he felt that that relationship had done more damage over the years than it had provided support, uplift. He wanted to say it, but he felt that it was a lie. Magnified and sanctified was not how he was feeling. And so I sent him this prelude to Kaddish by another close mentor and friend, Joe Septimus, who lives in New York, who wrote a piece for someone that he knew about a number of years ago. I don't know exactly when it was that he wrote this, but it was about recognizing that relationships can be painful and yet still being able to show up in community to recognize the passing of one's parent or one's close one in a solemn, dignified manner without lying to oneself. And so this on page 11 is, we won't read it out loud now, but is a version of Kaddish in English that Septimus, that Joe Septimus offered a friend of his, and I offered my friend. And it is also offered in community now, that if we find ourselves on Yom Kippur hearing Kaddish, hearing melodies that are supposed to have us in touch with memories of our parents or our siblings or others whose relationship with us damaged us in some way, hurt us in some way, that we stay with those feelings, that we honor those feelings that we have, that we don't sublimate those feelings for what we think we ought to feel, that we honor our feelings, everything. We are all Avaryanim, as Beth shared in the name of Alan Liu, and the Kol Nidre hits us as a melody. The high notes, the low notes, takes us to that place of yearning very quickly. And so what is it that we yearn for, that those relationships can show us in our lives now? What is it that we're really looking for? Let's dig deep into a particular episode in Torah where there is a great yearning for reconciliation. Let us go to the story of Joseph and Joseph's brothers on page 12, when at the end of the longer story, the brothers see that their father has died. Vayiru achi Yosef ki met avihem. This is the top of page 12, Genesis 50, verse 15. Jacob has passed, and now the brothers, vayiru, they either see, or, as the Midrash teaches us, vayiru and vayaru are the same. They either see or they become fearful. It's a double entendre, that word in Hebrew, the very first word. And they see that their father has passed, and they wonder, hang on a sec, what happens if Joseph still detests us, hates us, has been saving up all this resentment for all the years while Jacob was alive, and now he's going to get us. And now he's going to send in the chariots, surround our homes, and do the dirty. That's what he's going to do, and throw us into the big pit that he's reserved for us, just outside of Pitom or Ramses or whatever it was, right? He's reserved the pit for us, and he's going to throw us in there. And the text continues, you can read it in English, where they essentially send a message to Joseph that misquotes the father. The father doesn't actually say the lines that the brothers, we find nowhere in the text that Jacob ever gave this instruction to the brothers. It's not there. That Joseph should forgive them for their sins. It is also the first time that we have the phrase, Sana lepesha avdei Elokei avicha. That phrase, Sana, please, forgive now, the pesha, the iniquities, a line which is a thread, a repeating thread throughout all of Yom Kippur and all the Slichot. It starts here. This is the very first time forgiveness is asked, is required in the Torah text. You won't find it before then. This is the first time. Why is it anchored here? This is a very troubling text for many reasons. But one of the interesting things about this particular text is it becomes a leitmotif, a motif for later readings of what Yom Kippur is all about. On page 13 at the top, the Book of Jubilees, which is actually in the Apocrypha, it's not in the canon, it writes that essentially Yom Kippur is recompense for the day on which the brothers brought the goat, the ketonet pasim, the coat of many colors dipped in the blood of Joseph. And that day on which Jacob grieved his son was the day, the 10th of the 7th month. And on that day, therefore, it was ordained forevermore that the children of Israel should do recompense for the grieving that Jacob went through, that made him weep for Joseph, for that error, for that transgression, and that we might be cleansed of that transgression, the transgression of sibling rivalry, the transgression of breaking apart family, the transgression of bringing bad report to parents about our siblings. That is the transgression that Yom Kippur is speaking to. Fractured family relationships. Beth.
Well, there's a tension, because if we go back to the text 22, the text in Breshit and Genesis, it looks like everything is fine. And Joseph says, don't be afraid of me, verse 19. Am I God to punish you? You intended me harm, but everything's fine. Don't worry, we're all friends now. It's all over. Is it all over? And this is the question we're still dealing with. There's a tension, and we see in Midrash Tanhuma an argument that yes, this is a moment of peace. Everything is resolved. And we also have, we're running short on time, so we're not going to go into the details of it, but we also have from Rabbi Sachs in text 28 that Joseph taught, the Torah is teaching us about what forgiveness is, and this whole Joseph story is a story of forgiveness, and it gets wrapped up in a nice bow. And if that's the case, why are we still talking about it? And there's this great desire that we all have to complete the circle, to make things right. But in fact, sometimes we wrap it up a little too nicely. I mean, I see myself in this. I want everything to be nice. I want us all be getting along. And so I don't want to go to the really hard places. And this is what Aviva Zornberg, how she reads it. Because that line, what if he's still mad at us? The word lu can be read as, it actually doesn't mean what if, it means if only. If only he was still mad at us, say the brothers. Meaning, I just want to talk about it. He won't talk to us about it. He's forgiven us without getting mad at us first. We've never had a chance to have the interactions that we need to have to really do the full repair. And why? Because it's too hard. If you look at text, Aviva Zornberg talks about this, that it's text 29. The brothers on some level wish for him to express a hatred that unpurged will poison the fate of the family for many generations. And we see this throughout the rest of the whole Tanakh to this day, but definitely to the rest of the Tanakh. You can follow this sort of break between the family that's not fully healed. The tribes fight, it just goes on and on and on. And if we look at it closely, we see that this never gets repaired fully. But it goes on, a painful confrontation might have opened the wounds of the past, making real cure possible. But Joseph cannot allow that old anguish to resurface. That would involve an unsettling of old scores that he is anxious, as they are, to leave untouched. If only Joseph would hate us. This reading of Aviva Zornberg, and also we find it in the Orach Chaim in text number 25. And this is, Orach Chaim was a very famous Moroccan rabbi, died in 1743. He says, there is another level of meaning. They hope that he will pay them back, and that they will suffer in some way commensurate with the suffering they caused him. They need a closure, not just an apology. It's just like, okay, I forgive you. They need to talk about it. What do you think, Rabbi?
Imagining a synagogue, a big one, a big cathedral synagogue, in which we're all standing there, and then the ground rumbles, and then, you know, the earth moves, and this big pit just opens up, and we step back, and then suddenly there's this yawning chasm in the middle, and we're being asked to look into this pit that Joseph was thrown into. It all feels very dignified when we walk into shul. Right now, we're not walking into shul in the same way. I feel that there's an opportunity here to think of this Joseph story as a real lesson in missed opportunities for communicating well and effectively. That what gets communicated when we are arriving shura al shura, line on line in a synagogue, and we sit there and it's very decorous and it's not messy. We you know, the gabaim know exactly what's happening. You know, everything is done. But imagine the lights go out, the microphones go off. You know, suddenly the floor opens. That there's something here in this story that is profoundly messy and that refuses to be tied up with a red ribbon. And it's that moment that I'm really interested in. Sources 25 and 26 for me really are very powerful, that Joseph is on the way back to Egypt from burying their father. The Midrash says that Joseph sees the pit that his brothers threw him in and goes to its rim and looks into it and makes a blessing, a bracha, and that this bracha is healing. Like, the pit is staring at him. And yet this is a pit that was, for him, the pit from which he was redeemed and from which was a launching pad to everything else. So for him, this pit was a makom, a makor, chayim, of life, actually, even though it didn't appear at the time. For the brothers, watching him muttering to himself at the rim of that pit, one can only imagine them thinking, I will get them. Just wait until we return to Egypt and I will have such, you know, for me, there's a great opportunity for Joseph to have walked from his incantations by the side of the pit up to his brothers then and re-embrace them, but he didn't. He walked on.
Right, and they misinterpret his inner healing as something completely different. And it makes me wonder how much I'm misinterpreted, how much I misinterpret by not communicating. And I think this is the challenge that we sit with. That's the challenge of the phone that you started with. What would we say if we could say it? And maybe we should just say it. But I don't want to make it simple, because it's not. Because, like he said, it feels very dangerous. It might not work out. I might blow it again. My words might not come out right. And then what? Will I make it worse? So we sit with this challenge as we pass it back to Chava. We're not going to tie this up in a nice little ribbon. That's not the point. Life isn't a nice, tight little ribbon. And yet we go through together as a varyonim, as those who pass through. We pass through together, and that's what gives us strength and hopefully courage and hopefully comfort as well.
You know, it's interesting you talk about the phone, and you made the sign of the phone, right? It comes as such second nature. People were rushing to the phone of the wind, couldn't queue up long enough to get on that phone. I wonder how many of us have been staring at a phone once in our lives. Can we make that call? Should we make the call? What will happen when we make the call? It's not easy to make the call. Maybe this year we might make a call, even just one call, to one person whom we may or may not know or respond in such and such a way. Maybe it's time for us to make that phone call that we haven't been making all these years, all these months, all these weeks, or just yesterday. And if we feel that leaving a voice note is probably a safer option, that's also an option. The phone of the wind is there to communicate to us that making a phone call sometimes has very healing effects. And it's sometimes better to make it than not make it. Who knows what relationships can be held in that moment?
As we wrap up this session, we want to thank you all so much for being here. And we're challenged. We feel that call to challenge, to let our voices rise, and to really feel that urgency ticking down that happens every year to make the calls that we need to make. So let me just thank you, Rabbi Samuel and Beth, for sharing your wisdom with us today. Thank you so much to Alana and Tony for helping us to facilitate this. We also want to thank the whole Federation, Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, and Susan and Lonnie Adelheit for your contributions here. And thank you all for joining us for this and last session. We have one more session coming up on October 6th, which is called Rising Up. And so we hope that you will all be there to rise up. Yale. Yale. Tachanu neinu meret. Ve'yavo. Chava teinu miboker. Thank you again for joining us. I'm going to keep singing.